transphobes already citing it as like a massive transphobe dunk. Did like a kind of a brief skimming of the study. This one's a lot more honest than the first rapid onset gender dysphoria study. Like, it's very honest about these are parent reports. Parent reports are pretty intrinsically biased. It seems they're leaving out a very sinister but after that, right? The coding of this statement is positive when it seems to be right about to follow with a very sinister but. I don't know. Like we were initially loving and supporting, so you weren't currently loving and support. Like, what? That's what you think of as supportive statements? Although even with this bias, we can still learn some things from the parent reports. That is true. A lot of the conclusions from this new study aren't as transphobic as like the transphobes want it to be, or even just kind of like prove what's going on with just more kids are being able to figure out that they're trans. I think it's an interesting study to like actually dive into the data, because you're probably going to hear a lot of similar claims of transphobes citing this. Oh, look at this. We have another study on rapid onset gender dysphoria. Therefore, rapid onset gender dysphoria is real. This one is definitely a lot more honest. Okay, what they did is they had parental reports on 1,655 possible cases of rapid onset gender dysphoria. The rapid onset gender dysphoria hypothesis posits that this increase in people identifying as trans at younger ages, people transitioning at younger ages, is due to some kind of like social contagion. Some person in a friend group comes out as trans, and then everybody else is like magically trans by their trans friend. There was this website created, which was parentsofrogdkids.com. There were over 1,600 reports filed by parents on this website of, hey, I think that like my kid has rapid onset gender dysphoria. And this study sought out to like actually analyze the data of the parent report. Let's just be clear right off the bat. Parent reports does not prove that being trans is social contagion, rapid onset gender dysphoria is a real thing, or that this is a problem. That would be like if you surveyed, say, racist parents on their thoughts about their kids' interracial marriage. That doesn't mean that interracial marriage is bad. What it probably means is that these parents are racist, especially if you recruited them from something like parents of interracial marriage kids and I don't like blackpeople.com, something like that. If that was like the website, then yeah, you could probably assume that these parents are biased, and that doesn't really say anything to detract against interracial marriage, but we can learn something from their reports. Another thing that's really interesting about the study is that they do this based off of adolescent and young adults between the ages of 11 and 21 years of the parents first reporting their child experiencing gender dysphoria. There's a bit of a problem with that kind of age range right off the bat, in that suppose you have a massively transphobic parent and you have a trans kid, they know that their parents are massively transphobic, and so they're like, I do not feel safe coming out to my parents. And then the only way that their parents find out that their kid is trans is after the kid is 18, moves out of the house. They're an adult now, they move out of the house, they start transitioning, come out as trans, etc. According to this study, this would be counted as an instance, or I guess a possible case of rapid onset gender dysphoria, because it's based off of the parent's perspective. In the parent's perspective, this trans kid who has known they're trans their whole life and just been closeted because the parents are transphobic would be counted as a rapid onset gender dysphoria case just because the kid was not comfortable telling their parents. That's another bit of a potential flaw in the methodology. It's really hard to tell, like just based on the data we have here, whether or not this kid was experiencing gender dysphoria from a young age or trans identity from a young age, but they were just they were just too scared to tell a parent. That's exactly why if you wanted to conduct a study on like social contagion resulting in trans people or rapid onset gender dysphoria, you have to study the trans kids themselves. Just studying the parents is prone to be subject to the biases of the transphobic parents. And yeah, these parents are absolutely pretty transphobic if they're going to websites like parentsofrogdkids.com. They note that there's kind of like two competing hypotheses. There has not been an increase in the actual number of gender dysphoric adolescents, but more of them are being recognized and referred to gender clinics. Glad they're recognizing that, it's not just the case that we're immediately fronting the rapid onset gender dysphoria hypothesis as true and the only answer. They're saying the rapid onset gender dysphoria hypothesis was created to compete with this idea that there's always been kind of this amount of trans people, but it's just more people are able to realize that they're trans, and more people are able to realize they're trans at a younger age. We're talking about the rapid onset gender dysphoria hypothesis, that there's been an increase in gender dysphoria among adolescents, especially adolescent transmasculine people. They have 3 citations for this. They have the original Bunk Lisa Lippman study, this 2017 study, which actually it's not a study, it's a Quillette article. Their 3 citations is the Bunk original rapid onset gender dysphoria study, a random Quillette article, Schreier 2020, which they don't even have a link to the citation, which is her book Irreversible Damage, which was a heavily biased transphobic book. Right off the bat, we can see that the evidence is pretty terrible for the rapid onset gender dysphoria study. I also would have appreciated if they actually supported a couple of other studies which have come out recently, specifically debunking the core premises of the rapid onset gender dysphoria study. But if your only citations are a study which has been thoroughly corrected and debunked, a Quillette article, and a transphobe's book, it's not very good evidence. This section, they're talking about why they believe that parental reports have value. And what's interesting about this is that they note that there is absolutely lots of biases surrounding using parental reports. Oh, this one's other really funny. They're talking about like Facebook groups, very interesting, like Facebook communities and their online communities, talking about either rapid onset gender dysphoria communities or like trans support groups. We now have a blogger, which we're citing, very very credible source. You'll notice that like all the citations on the rapid onset gender dysphoria study is a Quillette article, a blogger who's writing about how they don't want their daughter to be trans. They're trying to justify the use of parental reports as valuable study criteria. First, on the basis of there are a bunch of citations of various studies throughout history which have used parent reports. But I think that it is really a lot more context dependent. So I don't think that parent reports can say like nothing about a given topic, although they would be most useful if we're talking about something in like very, very young children, where if you have a child that is so young that they don't really have a great grasp at communication, having parental reports is often very helpful in order to kind of supplement the data or the limited data you can provide from the child. Now, if we're talking about like teenagers and young adults, this is a study population where you can actually talk to them and you can get a lot more data out of them. That's still not to say that you can't learn anything about parental reports, but it's definitely important to note that your parental reports are going to be heavily biased, especially if you're recruiting them from websites that already agree with the rapid onset gender dysphoria premise, such as parentsofrogdkids.com. We expect parents and children's reports are more similar for families in which parents support their children's transition. Good to acknowledge that. It's important to seek data from all sources and premature to reject any of them. Like, I definitely agree that we can learn things from the parent reports, but it's at least good that they're acknowledging that like they're biased by nature. Not everything that's going on can be learned just from the parents, especially parents that are biased. You can see off the bat that anybody who responds to the survey is going to be pretty heavily biased. This is the actual email that they sent out to people who are on the website in order to solicit a survey response. It says, rapid onset gender dysphoria is a new phenomenon that is only now beginning to be recognized. The so-called gender clinics are not forthcoming with information about demographics or mental health issues of clients who seek out their services, nor do they publish information on patient outcomes. Not true, but the task is left up to us, the parents, to seek out this information on our own. Please help us gain a better understanding of this emotionally devastating and physically traumatizing, yet increasingly common phenomenon. Yikesy language. Who should complete the survey? If your child had a relatively normal childhood without showing any signs of discomfort with their gender, and suddenly, seemingly out of the blue, decided they identified as the opposite gender, or some other quote-unquote gender, please take the time to fill out the survey. It takes about 10 to 15 minutes to complete, a bit longer if you write comments, which are very helpful. Don't worry if the survey skips over some questions. It's designed to skip over questions that do not apply to you. All responses will be strictly confidential. So they do explicitly acknowledge, the authors acknowledge that the framing of the survey is biased towards belief in and concern about rapid onset gender dysphoria. This may have influenced responses, although it is likely that a more important bias was self-selection due to the website's name and purpose. Good thing that they're very upfront about the biases of the survey, but very yikesy language in there. Seems out of the blue because these parents don't pay attention to their kids. Yeah, that's exactly along the lines of what I was saying earlier, where especially with that wide range of ages, and especially if these parents don't have trans supportive tendencies, it's very likely that they won't notice or that they'll just dismiss any kind of discussions around gender, or that kids might be too afraid to come out to their parents, and that, you know, their first time hearing it is when these kids eventually try to come out to transphobic parents, which we know doesn't always go very well. Yeah, here we go. Okay, these are the results of the study. Most of the reports came from mothers, which is actually pretty interesting. You had 84% of the survey respondents coming from mothers, and then 12.6% coming from fathers. And then there was like a couple others that were other relationships, like step-parent, grandparent, or adoptive parent. I wonder if there's something particular about like the outreach of like the rapid onset gender dysphoria crowd, hypothesis, community, whatever you want to call it, specifically towards like mothers of trans kids. which that's an interesting finding already. Okay, yeah, this one's okay. This table is really interesting. They had statements indicating either supportive or progressive attitudes or unsupportive / conservative attitudes. Statements were coded as supportive / progressive if they indicated that parents were politically progressive, including supportive of LGBT rights and people. This included evidence that they were at least partially supportive of their child's gender-related choices. Emails were coded as unsupportive / conservative if they indicated parents were conservative or religious in ways that may not be supportive of LGBT rights or people. Statements indicating either conservative or religious beliefs or not, by themselves, coded as the latter. The number of coded statements indicating supportive / progressive sentiments was 70, and the number indicating unsupportive / conservative sentiments was 5. And then they have some examples of each. And what's really interesting about these is the supportive statements don't really seem all that supportive or indicative of supporting trans people. The first statement we have right here is mother and partner are a same-sex couple. That doesn't really say anything about whether or not they would support trans people. It's weird that they would just like take that little bit and say that this is immediately a supportive progressive statement. There are plenty of prominent TERFs out there who claim to be lesbians, for example. I don't think that that's necessarily a supportive statement, right? Like if this was actually a supportive statement, you think that there would be something more they could add onto it than just like, I'm a mother and I'm gay. It could be, I'm a mother, I'm gay, and I support my trans kid. Or it could be, I'm a mother, I'm gay, and I don't support my trans kid. Like, that doesn't really give you anything as to whether they would support trans kids. This one says, we knew nothing about this ROGD up until my son told us he was transgender. We were initially, of course, entirely loving and supportive of him. It seems they're leaving out a very sinister but after that, right? The coding of this statement is positive when it seems to be right about to follow with a very sinister but. I don't know. Like we were initially loving and supporting, so you weren't currently loving and support. Like, what? That's what you think of as supportive statements? This one says, any discussion of her sex, sexuality, and or gender issues resulted in verbal and physical abuse. What? She has accused us all of homophobia, transphobia, and assorted other bigotry. To be honest, I would love her to declare she's a lesbian and move on. How was that a supportive statement? This is saying, I don't want her to be trans, I just want her to be a lesbian. Oh, they're probably talking about a trans man. Or it's like, I don't want him to be trans. I just wish that he was gay. They're coding this as a supportive statement. This is exactly what a bigot would say. Like, why can't you just be gay? Why do you have to be trans? That's what bigots say to trans people all the time. I think that we need to know a lot more about what the discussions of sex, sexuality, and gender issues looks like if it's resulting in verbal and physical abuse. How do you code this as a supportive statement? Number 4 says the LGBT community's influence is very strong and their support seems to have no end. I myself am a supporter and have friends in the community, but this has nothing to do with them and is none of their business. It's about me doing what is best for my child. So saying, I have a trans friend, but that's a supportive statement? Since when was I have a trans friend, but my child is not it? How was that a supportive statement? Number 5 says, at age, she told us she was gay. I didn't freak out. I don't really care if she's gay. Then last year, she asked me to take her to the Pride Festival. I wanted to be supportive, so I took her. This also seems like we're going to have a really sinister, but why can't you just be gay? Once again, all of these supportive statements are not really supportive. And these were the example statements that they had. Like, this is them cherry picking out of what they claimed to be was, what, 70 supportive statements? They claimed that they had 70 supportive statements, and these are the best 10 they can pick out? None of these are supportive. Number 6 is, one of my husband's good friends is transgender. My husband, having a personal experience with a transgender friend, helped her to realize that we weren't bigots when we said that we're not going to affirm her friend's choice of pronouns. I have a trans friend who says I don't have to support my trans kid. That's a supportive statement? This is so crazy. Number 7 says, my brother came out as gay. My mom, who works in blank, knows a lot about sexuality. She thinks it's a harmless sexual kink for many men to be treated like a woman, but it does not really mean he is uncomfortable being a man. He just wants to be desired and loved for a specific time like he thinks a woman is desired and loved. I'm okay with gay people, but I think that my child is just divulging into a kink and that they're not really trans. That's a supportive statement? None of these statements are supportive. That's the craziest thing. What supportive means is if they're LGB drop the T, that's considered a supportive sentiment. And these were the cherry-picked 7 best ones they could find. Did they say it was like randomly sampled? Table 1 contains 7 examples of supportive progressive statements, every 10 statements starting at the first. Okay, this is a random sample. Every single one listed is not a supportive statement. Yeah. They might mean supportive in the other way, as in supportive of why can't you just be gay? Pro tip, if you're doing a study and you read your results and you do like some kind of coding, and you read your results and you're like, you know, these results really don't match up with like what the coding is supposed to mean. That means you did your coding wrong. You should do a better job and recode them so that they're actually logically clustered. Maybe we could have one category of unsupportive conservative statements, which these statements do seem to be pretty explicitly unsupportive and conservative. Things like children who just think they can change gender. God created male and female. We need somebody who is conservative, maybe faith-based. Help my son figure out what's going on. I don't believe it's God's best for people. Guide our daughter back to her authentic biblical faith. You're being called homophobic, transphobic, violent, abusive. I struggle constantly to show love to someone who shows complete disdain for everything that's been dear to my heart, for my faith, to my country, and my traditions. Yeah, those are pretty explicitly in support of conservative. Maybe it would have been better to have like 3 categories. Holy shit, yeah, number 10 is asking for conversion therapy. So like they could have done like a 3-system coding where you have one code for explicitly unsupportive or conservative statements. You have another code for sinister but statements, or things like, why can't you just be gay, or I support gay people. But there was another common trope of, I have a trans friend, but definitely should have been like a separate category for supportive of gay rights but not trans rights, or another category for I support trans people, but they can do a much better job at coding this. 70 supportive statements under that coding system. That's an incredibly misleading result. I think number 3 is saying that she's abusive towards her parents. Well, you have to keep in mind that these are parents' reports. Yeah, they're saying that their child is being abusive towards the parents, but we have no clue about like what the parents are saying to the child. How do you cite this as a supportive statement when they're like, yeah, things are getting really abusive and they're calling us transphobic? How do you code that as supportive? Hard to read since from context. Yeah, a lot of these are also missing some pretty important context, it seems. That table is incredibly sketchy. Okay, then we have parent estimates of when the gender dysphoria began. On average, youth reported 14.8 years when they became gender dysphoric. Onset ages ranged from 3 to greater than 25 years with a median of 14. Well, what's actually interesting about this is that if people are saying that, like, kids are now just, like, all coming out as trans at, like, 7 years old, even the transphobic parents say that it's beginning at, like, age 14 or 15. Even the transphobic parents don't think it's happening that early. Inclusion-exclusion criteria, excluding people who had younger onset gender dysphoria in order to include the like ages 11 to 21 category in particular. 75% of the sample were transmasculine, 25% of the sample was transfeminine. Mean current age was 15.7 for transmasc and 17.2 for transfem. So showing that the transmasc population was finding out a little bit earlier on average, or at least that the transmasc population was coming out a little bit earlier than average, because these aren't necessarily when the gender dysphoria began, but when the kid came out to the parents, because we're relying on parent reports. 79% European, then mixed, Asian, Indigenous, African American, Middle Eastern, East Indian. Most of them were in Canada. Prior social adjustment. What do we have going on? Yeah, this chart in general shows that like quite a bit of social support is lacking for these trans youth. Like they definitely are missing a lot of social support that they could need. Okay, mental health history. Let's see, 57% other mental health issues. So what this shows is that overwhelmingly, it was the case that there were mental health issues that were understood or recognized by the parent before the kid reported being trans, before the kid came out, which makes a lot of sense because we know that, you know, untreated gender dysphoria can result in depression, anxiety. This study absolutely backs up this claim that if a gender dysphoria is untreated, that creates a lot of depression, anxiety, other kind of like mental health problems. Overwhelmingly, the most things that we're seeing are depression, anxiety, problems like socializing, stress, which those often manifest as a result of gender dysphoria. Once again, adding more evidence to this idea that, you know, these are mental health issues created by untreated and or unrecognized gender dysphoria. The bigger parts of like the rapid onset gender dysphoria hypothesis, or the people that really promote this kind of concern, I see a lot of those types always saying that like, oh, you just have autistic people who, you know, they're not really trans, they're just autistic. And they particularly say that with like autistic AFAB people, yet we have only 6.5% of the AFAB sample was autistic, or at least had the autism diagnosis. Definitely goes against the idea that like it's just a bunch of like autistic AFAB people who are now becoming trans for no reason. And also, yeah, as if you can't be autistic and trans. In fact, there tends to be a correlation between the two, because autistic people typically don't experience a need to fulfill societal expectations as strongly as autistic people do. So they're more likely to be like, yeah, I don't really care if society tells me that I have to be a girl. I want to be a boy. I'm going to be a boy. Which, power to them. Power to them. Ask whether stressful events may have contributed to the onset of gender dysphoria. 72.6% said yes. I'm not really sure why they would think that moving makes somebody trans, or failing to get a date makes somebody's trans. Like, this doesn't really make sense at all. Obviously, these are the transphobic parents' reports, but I really wish they could explain to me why does the family moving make the kid trans? Or why does, like, having a hard time dating make somebody trans? It's harder to date when you're trans as compared to when you're cis. There are lots of people that don't want to date a trans person. We moved to the liberal city and my kid got trans. So true, so true. That's pretty crazy. I have no clue why they would think that. But once again, more evidence showing that these transphobic parents are kind of crazy. Intelligence rating, as in the parents had to rate how smart their kids were. And big surprise, most parents rated their kids as pretty smart. Fun little piece of sexism in transphobic parents is that they rated the kids who were assigned male at birth significantly higher than the kids who were assigned female at birth. We also have some subtle sexism going on in the parents' reports, which all right. Now they're talking about social transition. We had 65% of the sample socially transitioning, 33.8% have not socially transitioned, and then 1% no longer wish to transition, i.e. had desisted. You know, it's really funny that even the transphobic study says that the detransition rate is just 1%. Look at that! Mean age of social transition reported at about 15. So like a year after, that's like about a year after the mean age of when the parents like reported the onset of gender dysphoria starting. That also goes to show that like trans kids put a lot of time and thinking into before socially transitioning, which yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I thought long and hard for months, probably like half a year even, before I was like really committing to socially transitioning. People think about this a long time. I mean, showing that, like, even on average, there was a year of deliberation before they started socially transitioning, shows that they're putting some thought into it. Social transition was more common amongst AFABs, which would also make sense because they came out earlier. So if you come out earlier, you're also more likely to start socially transitioning. So yeah, that makes sense. Here's a table on social transition. Here's a table on medical transition. Clothes, hairstyle, change pronouns, change posture. What? That's a funny one. Transgender friends. What? Breast binding, penis tucking, bra stuffing. Oh, these are hilarious. Now, medical transition, we have 1% versus 2% on hormone blockers. Even in this study of like the particularly transphobic parents, the rates of medical transition are not that high. I think this is probably a good portion of this has to do with the fact that like transphobic parents aren't going to allow their kids to access affirming treatment. But I think it also goes to show that there are more people today who are identifying as transgender but who are not transsexual, as in they only desire to socially transition. That's great. Yeah, they should be able to live their lives as they want. Wearing different clothes or changing your name or pronouns, no big deal at all. Oh, this one's funny. We have change in change in functioning. It seems that all the transphobic parents think that their kid is doing worse after coming out as trans. Gee, I wonder why the transphobic parents would think that their kid's doing worse after coming out as trans. Change in parental relationships also tended to be negative by about a 1-point decrease on a 5-point scale. About half of them felt pressured by gender clinics to transition their child socially or medically, saying that they didn't like that their doctors said, hey, you should support your kid. Only 37% had received a referral to a gender specialist. So that would definitely partially explain why you saw very, very little rates of actually being able to access medical care. Possible social influences. Asked whether the youths were friends with others who came out as transgender around the same time. 55% said yes. This is also like part of the rapid onset gender dysphoria hypothesis that like one kid in a friend group comes out as trans and then like everybody in the friend group is trans. I doubt that that's what's like actually happening, but it tends to be the case. Trans people tend to get along really well with other trans people, often even before they know that they're trans. It's like how in JoJo's Bizarre Adventures, stand users attract other stand users. It's very much the case that trans users attract other trans users. Heck, I've seen this myself where one of my ex-partners also turned out to be trans, and we both dated back when we thought we were both cis. Very funny to see that in retrospect. Trans people are stand users? Absolutely. So it's not that unlikely to see that like a trans person would have a transgender friend. And also if they like talk about being trans, it's very possible that their eggs crack at like similar times, because one person cracks their egg and they're like talking about it and they're like, oh shit, that's my experience too. And that's how they discover. Not that unlikely. Internet and social media. Oh, this also goes in the idea that parents think that like social media is transing the kids. Okay. No evidence that this is like causal. It's just parent reports. I mean, 4.5 hours a day. I think that makes sense as like how often kids are on social media these days. People are on social media pretty often these days. All right, now we're into the discussion section. Let's get into it. Results of our study are generally consistent with other research about the current surge of gender dysphoria among youth with onset during adolescence or adulthood. I think it's pretty funny to suggest that high intelligence is common in their sample, and they just ask parents if their kid is smart. Most parents are gonna say that their kid's smart. That seems pretty prone to parental bias. Most youths had changed their pronouns. Evidence of immersion both in social media and peer groups and with other trans identifying youths. Yeah, because trans people tend to be friends with trans people, just like how conservatives tend to be friends with conservatives. And people find friends that are like them. AMABs were less likely to social transition. They had to do something with kind of like anxieties surrounding how society sees like gender nonconformity. Society is definitely more accepting of like tomboys than femboys in general. Although this is improving, But I think that might also have to kind of deal with, like, where you have, like, a trans woman who's younger and, like, she's really afraid to come out and socially transition, knowing how society treats people who, you know, might be perceived as, like, a feminine boy when she's in the process of, like, socially transitioning and not quite passing. Society definitely treats non-passing trans women worse than non-passing trans men, and I think that that has a lot to do with why you would see more trans women being kind of averse to social transition if they're afraid that they're not going to pass, especially if they don't have, like, supportive parents, like these parents. Oh, here's a crazy line. The current study's results are consistent with the existence of different causes for gender dysphoria in AFABs and AMABs, at least in some cases. Specifically, one kind of gender dysphoria, stemming from autogynephilia, a natal male sexual arousal at the idea of being female, occurs only in adolescent and post-adolescent natal males and does not appear to have an analog among natal females. Citing Dr. Ray Blanchard, it's well known that Dr. Ray Blanchard didn't really study trans men and, like, didn't really believe that trans men were, like, a thing as much as trans women were, because Dr. Blanchard thought that, like, being trans was, like, a sexual paraphilia, just in general. Citing this as, like, fact is pretty crazy, especially when it's known that, like, Dr. Blanchard's research on trans men is rather intentionally lacking. Okay, once this robust finding was both disturbing and seemingly important, youth with a history of mental health issues were especially likely to have taken steps to socially medically transition. Yeah, because gender dysphoria causes the mental health issues. That's disturbing? Let's see. The findings of worries of parents whose preferences differ from their gender dysphoric children. It's consistent with other findings to say that parents believe gender clinics and clinics pressure their families toward transition. It's particularly concerning given that parents tend to rate their children as worse off after transition. Why do you think they did that? Like, this all is explained by the fact that the parents were transphobic. All right, here we go to the limitations. So first, parents were recruited via website for parents who believe their children have rapid onset gender dysphoria rather than more conventional and less problematic form of gender dysphoria. Such parents are unlikely to be representative of all parents. However, it's unclear how one might recruit a representative sample of parents reporting on their gender dysphoric adolescents. There's actually some ways you could do this. One way you could do is you could take all of the referrals to a gender identity clinic. The way you could do it is you could do a broad a broad survey, say, like, of youth school children, and then you correlate the answers of that survey with follow-ups on the parents. Where you first do a survey of adolescents, figuring out which adolescents they identify as trans, and then you survey the parents of those adolescents. Not a perfect methodology, especially given that, like, it would require kids to come out. You could definitely take some approaches to, like, actually serving a more representative sample of parents, or you could just talk to the kids themselves, because this is a population that's old enough to talk. Really a shame we don't have data on the actual kids themselves, because that really seems like the most important group to study. If you're trying to observe a phenomenon happening in children, you should study children, not their disapproving parents. Yeah, it's really strange that they would only talk to the parents after this approach has already been done before by the Lisa Littman paper. If they were trying to prove rapid onset gender dysphoria, why would they use the exact same flawed methodology that Lisa Littman did? Like, why wouldn't you actually survey the kids themselves, as was suggested the whole time? Seems strange they would just, like, try to replicate her research when her research was very flawed for that very reason. They're addressing the limitation that most people who do actually go to gender clinics are not transphobic parents who believe in rapid onset gender dysphoria, which, I mean, like, that would be like asking, like, a vaccine clinic. It's like the difference between asking anti-vaxxers versus asking data at, like, a vaccine clinic. The anti-vaxxers are going to not take their kids to vaccine clinics, so you end up getting rather different populations that go to each of those. Parent reports could be biased and inaccurate. That's a very generous could be biased or inaccurate. Overly generous. Further, limited research on parents has shown the opposite, that such parents tend to be politically progressive and tend to hold tolerant attitudes towards sexual and gender minorities. Lisa Littman and Abigail Schreier, who once again use this same flawed approach that LGB drop the T is considered supportive. Our results also support that view. Once again, they coded LGB drop the T or I have a trans friend but as supportive. The methodology of saying that the parents that believe in rapid onset gender dysphoria are often supportive of trans people, no. The results don't show that. You just used a bad coding system. They want rapid onset gender dysphoria to be true so bad, and they're gonna use their little weaselly explanations as much as they can because they just want it to be true. Okay, and then future directions. Our study relies on informative information provided by parents who believe their children have ROGD and are thus unlikely to be supportive about their children's transgender status and intentions to transition. Obviously, it would be highly desirable for future studies also to include parents with differing beliefs and attitudes. So why didn't you do that? Because, like, we already had the study of just the transphobic parents done before. Furthermore, response from gender dysphoric adolescents and young adults themselves would be extremely important. Why didn't you do that? They keep on mentioning that, like, oh yeah, it would be better if we had other methodologies, but we're just gonna recreate the flawed methodology. I know, it's so crazy that they acknowledge that their study has the exact same methodological flaws that Lisa Littman's paper did, and then they still just went ahead and recreated her paper and like didn't do anything to survey the trans kids themselves, differences between trans supportive and trans unsupportive parents. It's just the same bad methodology again. So that's the new Rapid Onset Gender Dysphoria study. It's a little bit more honest, but at the same time, very clear that their bias is heavily influencing the research, because they use the flawed methodology of trying to discern about trans people based off of the reports of their transphobic parents.